This memorial provided one of the magical moments of our first 8-week ramble around Scotland. Many of you know is home today to almost 5 million people of Scottish descent. We wanted to know more about where they came from, why did so many Scots emigrate in the first place, and how was it that once in Canada they had proven so influential. Robert Burns was an especially curious case. He never set foot in this country, yet every January tens of thousands of Canadians gathered to celebrate his birthday. Around the world, celebrants total something like 9.5 million. Think about it. Here in Canada, we hold elaborate dinners to honor a poet born in rural Scotland more than 250 years ago. And this we've been doing since before Confederation. Not only that, but statues of Burns can be found in cities across the country. Halifax, Fredericton, Montreal, Toronto, Windsor, Winnipeg, Edmonton, Vancouver, Victoria, they all boast a statue of Burns. Here in Canada, no other poet, and in fact no writer of any kind, has inspired anything approaching this level of commemoration in stone. Best of all, nobody is threatening to remove these statues. Yeah. But I started describing our first extended ramble. In 2008, on arriving at Glasgow Airport, we made a beeline for Burns country, a 1-hour drive to the south. Over the next 2 days, we visited the farmhouse in Alloway, where Burns was born. We stood on the Brigadoon, the bridge over the River Doon, where his fictional Tam O'Shanter narrowly escapes a passel of furious witches, and we marveled at a mural glorifying his life from birth to death. Then we traveled southeast to Dumfries and sat in the pub chair where in his later years Burns himself had often sat reading newspapers. We visited the upstairs bedroom where he sometimes slept, and down the street in the humble home where he lived for 3 years, we visited his study and the bedroom in which he died. In driving from Alloway to Dumfries, from one side of Burns country to the other, we followed the scenic route, winding along the coastal highway to Kirkcudbright. Thought I was going to get that wrong, didn't you? This colorful town features stone-built Georgian houses, a harbor crowded with small boats, and on the outskirts, the ruins of an abbey and a castle. Here it was that in the early 1700s, more than once, Robert Burns visited the Selkirk family. From the center of town, we drove to the south end, swung off the 2-lane highway, and followed a tree-lined road to a bay that opens onto the Irish Sea. In the 1700s, the Selkirk estate, more accessible by boat than horse and carriage, could be found at the tip of this peninsula called St. Mary's Isle. The original mansion was lost to fire decades ago, and today the site offers only trees and a few grazing horses. But when Robert Burns came calling in 1793, the place was quite splendid. 7 years before, in 1786, Burns had met one of the most charismatic members of the clan, called Lord Dare, and had written a poem singing his praises, marveling that a man designated a lord could be so modest and unassuming. My honest worthy man need care to meet with noble youthful Dare, for he but meets a brother. In 1793, when Burns turned up at the estate, Lord Dare was away from home. But the poet caught up with him in Kirkcudbright the following year when the Selkirk family hosted a dinner in the heart of town. Invited to say grace, Burns offered what is today known as the Selkirk grace. Some have meat and cannot eat, some no meat but want it. We have meat and we can eat, and so the Lord be thanked. Burns is often credited with having composed that grace, probably because he said it among the Selkirks, but it had existed for more than a century as the Galloway Grace. Bet you didn't know that. Well, maybe you did. I know I'm speaking to a bunch of experts here. Later that same year, in 1794, Lord Dare, the friend of Robert Burns, died of consumption. And 5 years after that, in 1799, the family patriarch followed him to the grave. 6 of the man's sons had died by then, and so the youngest of 7, 28-year-old Thomas Douglas, became the 5th Lord Selkirk. Still with me? Near the centre of Kirkcudbright, during our first ramble, we found a plaque in the parish churchyard, erected by Manitobans in 1978, that rightly credits the 5th Lord Selkirk with creating Scottish colonies in 3 Canadian provinces: Prince Edward Island, Ontario, and Manitoba. Probably someone here from Prince Edward Island. That 5th Lord Selkirk was the great early champion of large-scale Scottish emigration to British North America. Because Robert Burns had this connection with the Selkirk family, I found myself juxtaposing the beloved poet and this 5th Lord Selkirk, the visionary colonizer whose older brother had so mightily impressed the skeptical poet. Both made a mark on Canada. But the one was the son of a tenant farmer born in a croft, the other a nobleman who inherited a title and an estate. What could these 2 figures possibly have in common? First time around, that question brought me one answer: the Scottish Enlightenment. Born just 12 years apart, Burns and Selkirk were both products of that transformative period in the late 1700s when Scots surfaced as world leaders in science, literature, philosophy, engineering, and economics. That insight fueled my book, How the Scots Invented Canada, because the Enlightenment sent us so many Scottish leaders, most of them men driven to seek a better life. I published that book in 2010, and it did wonderfully well. Thank you very much. Over the next few years, I continued rambling around Scotland with Sheena without justification, simply because we both loved doing so. In the Highlands and Islands, inevitably, we were struck by the great number of ruined houses that dotted the landscape. I mean, who isn't? I began to realize that in How the Scots, I told only half the story. Focusing on leaders, I left out the common people, the people of Robert Burns. I had omitted the Highland clearances and the Burnsian figures who had struggled against them. Men like the stonemason Donald MacLeod and the activist journalist Donald Ross. I had at least mentioned Lord Selkirk, but now I perceived that Burns and Selkirk shared something beyond Enlightenment literacy of various kinds, and that was a passionate, heartfelt concern for the common man. The humanitarianism of Robert Burns is so well known as to hardly need elaboration. His compassion and empathy extend beyond even the human, as we see in his poem To a Mouse, which he wrote, as he says, on turning up in her nest with the plough, November 1785. Quote, "I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal." The poet's humanism drives the outrage that fuels his address of Beelzebub, which he wrote in 1786. He was responding to the actions of the Highland Society, an organization of landlords who sought to prevent 500 Highland farmers from emigrating in answer to exploitation. Keep in mind that this was still early in the clearances, when tenant farmers like Burns's father were departing of their own volition. Burns put his scathing denunciation into the mouth of Beelzebub one of the 7 princes of hell, who urges the Earl of Breadalbane to be even harsher in his treatment of the farmers, warning that, quote, while they are only plundered and robbed, they'll keep their stubborn Highland spirit. Beelzebub recommends sending the men to jail and the young women to London, where they can earn their living as prostitutes. Burns was furiously denouncing the treatment of the poor by the rich and powerful. He did not live to see the brutalities that ensued after his death in 1786. But here, if you'll permit me a brief quotation from Flight of the Highlanders, here is a voice that Burns would have applauded, that of the stonemason Donald MacLeod. I was an eyewitness of the scene, MacLeod wrote of a clearance that took place in 1814. Under the direction of one Patrick Seller, strong parties of men, quote, commenced setting fire to the dwellings till about 300 houses were in flames. The people striving to remove the sick, the helpless, before the fire should reach them. The cries of women and children, the roaring of cattle, the barking of dogs, the smoke of the fire, the soldiers, it required to be seen to be believed. I was present, the stonemason wrote, at the pulling down and burning of the house of William Chisholm, in which was lying his wife's mother, an old bedridden woman of nearly 100 years of age. When Patrick Seller arrived, MacLeod added, I told him of the poor old woman, being in a condition unfit for removal. He replied, damn her, the old witch, she's lived too long, let her burn. Robert Burns did not live to hear of this or sundry other outrages committed during the clearances, but Thomas Douglas, Lord Selkirk, did. While attending university in Edinburgh, young Douglas had taken to spending his summers exploring the Highlands and Islands. He had taken to the people and learned to speak Gaelic, and when in 1799 he became Earl of Selkirk, he turned immediately to helping those in distress. Lord Selkirk used his fortune to establish colonies in Canada that could accommodate those Highlanders driven from their ancestral homes, an action that led him into violent conflict with certain other Highlanders then running the fur trade out of Montreal. It's all in the book. The point here is that Selkirk acted in the spirit of Robert Burns. When I understood that, only then was I able to write Flight of the Highlanders. But I began this commemoration with our visit to Mauchline. The Robert Burns National Memorial provided magical excitement for me and Sheena because her grandfather designed it, an architect born in Argyll who emigrated to Toronto. Built in the Scottish baronial style, a shrine central to the poet's life and times. The red sandstone monument grows wider as it gets higher and features several odd angles and circular substructures. The memorial is incredibly evocative of the wild and original spirit of Robert Burns.